If I could have your attention, please, we're going to get started with our presentation today. Thank you. Wow, that's great. Some folks have asked me, what was the thinking behind having someone come and talk about poverty on our Pledge Sunday? And in my mind, this makes sense, because we're being reminded of the needs that are out there. And our pledge is in response to those needs, and how God calls us to those needs. Emily Jones hails originally from Connecticut, but most immediately from Chicago. But I imagine, the Midwest just can't get a New Englander all the New England out of here, so good to have you back. She is the Interfaith coordinator for the Interfaith Coalition to Reduce Poverty in Rhode Island. It's a wonderful organization that's been working for a number of years to see how different faith groups can get together and to do work to help reduce poverty in Rhode Island. I don't want to say much more. She's going to share about poverty in East Greenwich, poverty in Rhode Island, different ways that we can respond. And we're thrilled to have you here, Emily. Thank you very much for coming.
Well, thank you so much for having me. It's a gift and joy to be here. And thank you for your faithfulness in staying to talk about a difficult topic when it is a gorgeous sunny afternoon. And there are other things calling, so I appreciate that. I'm going to begin just with a word from Matthew. I'm sure it's familiar to almost all of you. Then the righteous will answer him, Lord, when was it that we saw you hungry and gave you food, or thirsty and gave you something to drink? And when was it that we saw you a stranger and welcomed you, or naked and gave you clothing? And when was it that we saw you sick or in prison and visited you? And the king will answer them, Truly I tell you, just as you did it to one of the least of these who are members of my family, you did it to me. Familiar to many of us, I am sure, but still I think a worthy reminder as we continue to live in a state where 14.3% of us are living at or below the federal poverty line. 3 of 20 Rhode Islanders are struggling with poverty, and so we hold this scripture in tension with that reality. A little bit more about the Interfaith Coalition. So as Pastor Jonathan mentioned, we are an interfaith group. We are a coming together of congregations both within the Christian spectrum across many lines of difference, Catholics and Baptists and Pentecostals and Presbyterians, but we're also bringing together across broader faith lines as well, so include a number of active Jewish congregations and organizations. My office is at the Jewish Alliance, and they have made generous space for me despite my Methodist background, and we work with mosques as well in the area because there's a real sense that this is an issue that crosses lines of faith. It affects everyone in our community. Poverty doesn't know a denomination or an affiliation. And also because despite the many ways that our traditions are theologically very different, we have common ground on this, right? There's a striking invitation from the scripture that we just read to the many, many others we could have read, to thinking about tikkun olam, which is a really important Jewish concept about healing the broken world, and which is actually the theme for the May 11th conference. That Pastor Jonathan mentioned, to thinking about the third pillar of Islam. There is a common call and a common witness as people of faith that we are invited to care for one another. And so we believe, as the Interfaith Coalition, we're an organization that's been around about 8 years, a mix of faith groups and advocacy groups. We believe in some very basic and fundamentals that we can all agree on, which every person, beloved and created by God, is deserving of 5 fundamental essentials, right, for human dignity. 1, food, right? Everybody needs adequate basic nutrition. Housing, we all need a safe, affordable place to live. Education, which we believe is the long-term pathway out of poverty and must be available to everyone. Healthcare, which is so important from birth and frankly prenatal care all the way up through seniors and end-of-life care. And finally, good jobs with decent wages so we can support ourselves and support our families. This is the core on which all of our work rests and has rested for 8 years. However, the individual issues that we're working on change year to year based on what's going on at a state level, where we believe we can make an impact. Because we think that there's a really important role for faith communities, not only in the direct service that so many of us do so well, but also in advocating and asking the upstream question of what happened that we have so many people who are needing to utilize our food pantries? What happened that we have so many folks struggling with homelessness in our state? What happened and what can we do to fix some of those upstream problems at a policy level and at a structural level, at the same time that we're also providing the direct care, the support, the meal programs, the shelter fundraisers, whatever we need to do at a direct level. So that's a little bit of who we are and where we come from. But first, I always like to break the ice a little bit by thinking about what are some of the stereotypes we have? What are the conceptions we have about what the face of poverty looks like? Right, so I just invite, if anyone can throw out, what are some of those stereotypes that we often hear about poverty?
Lazy.
Laziness, yeah. What else?
Drug addiction.
Drug addiction. Mm-hmm.
Taking advantage.
Taking advantage, right? This sense of people sapping the system, right? Certainly those are some.
Lack of opportunity.
A lack of opportunity, yeah, absolutely. Lack of opportunity, that there isn't a pathway for folks. Anything else?
That it's a specific nationality.
Specific nationality, yes, we hear that a lot, right? That poverty is some ethnic or racial groups and not others. Okay. So I'd add one more, which is something we sometimes hear about poverty that I think is a dangerous stereotype, is that it's very, very rare, right? That poverty is just those few people, over here who happen to be in need.
These and then these. And what's going around? Thank you. What's going around are two pieces. One is a general piece around poverty in Rhode Island and just a few things to know. And the other is more specific data about East Greenwich, right? Because when I knew I was coming here, I assume that many of you are also invested not only in this question for Rhode Island, but this question for this community specifically. And so there's also some information going around about child poverty and child wellness indicators throughout the state for East Greenwich specifically. But I just want to begin by countering some of those stereotypes that we hear. And I'm going to group them in. The first one that came up, right, is that people are poor because they are lazy, right, or because they are weak, right? We hear that a fair amount. And to counter that, this is actually a national statistic, but 1 in 7 homeless adults are veterans of the U.S. Armed Forces, right? I mention that because I think as we think about, well, people are lazy and weak, and that is what has led them into this place of homelessness. It stands in contrast with the fact that actually 1 in 7 have completed military service, which is certainly not a thing that you do out of laziness or weakness, right? So there are these realities. 1 in 5 live heat homes, folks receiving heating assistance, are also U.S. veterans. When we look at the statistics about the community food bank, right, the Rhode Island Community Food Bank serves 60,000 people in need per month, and that actually doesn't capture the full scope of need. Just a little note on this, because many faith organizations and other organizations are also providing independent aid. We just can't quantify that because it's more scattered site. But of the folks that the community food bank serves, 44% of those households have at least one person employed, right? So folks are working, folks are seeking those opportunities. So that's the first stereotype I would challenge. The second that's related is that poverty only exists, for special groups, right? And I think that's part of what we were hearing. Both sometimes we hear that thinking about race and ethnicity, nationality, as someone mentioned. Sometimes we think about that in terms of age or family structure, right? Sometimes there's a stereotype of a single adult homeless person, as that's the face of poverty. But again, when we look at the numbers here, who receives assistance through the food bank, 33% are children, are under 18, and 20% are 60 plus. So we're actually spanning the full gamut of life experiences and life stages and life ages, with peaks for children and the elderly, right? Which I think has a lot to do with social value and who we're supporting. And at the same time, when we look at this question of race and ethnicity, this becomes complicated because it is true that Latinos, African Americans, Native Americans here in Rhode Island have higher rates of poverty than white and Anglo folks, for sure. And that has to do with a history of racism and some current realities of racism as well. But it is also true that the majority of children living in poverty are white, right? And I think we need to be critical about what happens when we only imagine poverty as existing in communities of color, and what then are we disappearing, particularly in a state like Rhode Island, where white poverty is the majority of children in poverty, for example. And sometimes that lets us render certain kinds of things invisible. And then the third stereotype that I want to challenge with some of the numbers that we have here, if you look at this other sheet full of numbers, I'm not going to read it to you. I know everyone would quickly want to take a nap, or there'd be a math exodus, so I'm not going to read it, but I do want to point out, this is looking at East Greenwich and looking at Rhode Island. And certainly there's a stereotype that poverty is something that exists in Providence, Central Falls, Woonsocket, Pawtucket, right? Maybe some people say, oh yeah, I guess maybe in Newport too. But there's an invisible sense of poverty existing certainly in our core cities, but also in many of our suburbs and more rural areas. So if you look here at the statistics, you can see there's the Rhode Island-wide statistics as well as the East Greenwich statistics. So if you look at children living in families below the federal poverty threshold, is better than 20%, and frankly is still a huge problem, right? 7%, 7 out of 100 folks. I didn't do a count in worship, but I'm guessing that room is about 100. So if that is a room full of East Greenwich children, 7 of us are living at or below the federal poverty line. And then there's also the issue of senior poverty and poverty going on throughout the whole spectrum. Similarly, you can see if you scan down children and families receiving cash assistance, receiving SNAP benefits, which used to be called food stamps. People might know it as EBT, the EBT card. WIC participation. SNAP and WIC are both supplemental food programs, as is the school breakfast program. And you can look and you can see some of what's going on there, right? So we have 189 children as of 2015. These are the most recent numbers that we have. Children receiving SNAP benefits, right? So receiving supplemental food assistance. We see this, and I mention this because I think it's really important whenever we talk about this issue that we recognize that poverty is not something that is happening out there. Poverty is something that is happening in here, right? Poverty is something that is happening to our whole state, and not in an occasional kind of way, but in a deep kind of way. 14.3% of us living in poverty, 1 in 5 for children. So I mention all of that to give a little bit of data context for those of you who like data. I realize some of us are not data people, we're story people, so let me give some context there as well. Months ago, and I had this great privilege of bringing with me a group of folks from the Rhode Island Coalition for the Homeless Speakers Bureau. Do folks know the Rhode Island Coalition for the Homeless? Anyone? Okay, yes. So some people do. It's a great statewide organization, umbrella, that addresses issues around homelessness. And they have a speakers bureau of folks who have experienced homelessness who tell their stories. And we were going through, and I was, giving my little spiel about affordable housing and the importance of affordable housing. And then other folks were telling their stories. And one person who was a military veteran was talking about his experience. And his experience, frankly, was not so unusual. He didn't tell the sudden crash story, right? He told the story of family illness,
that gradually eroded some of the wealth and availability of resources. And he told a story of getting laid off. He had a middle-class job, but he got laid off in middle age and just wasn't able to find another one. He had savings, and those savings diminished and diminished until there was nothing left. And he found himself approaching the manager of a local grocery store because he had nowhere to live and to ask permission. And so what he did was he asked permission, can I park my car here at nights? And he slept in his car in the parking lot of the grocery store for a while, right? For a while. It took him a while to find housing. And what struck me so much as I was listening to him talk, as we were sharing in this experience together, is that this was not a dramatic story. This was a story of layoffs, a story of illness and medical expenses, a story of hitting hard luck and hard times, and having to find that as those things drifted away, what's available to you is to sleep in your parked car in the back of the Stop and Shop lot near where you used to live, and do live now, but without a home. Another woman told her story, and her story to experiencing homelessness was about a house fire, and similarly about this lack of resources there. These stories come up, and I think it's so important that we pay attention to them because they're boring stories. They're not the stories of a rock bottom experience that's going to flash on MTV or VH1 and become a redemption song. They're stories of regular experiences. I think I grew up in a community somewhat similar to this. I grew up in Fairfield County, Connecticut, which folks might know. I grew up in a wealthy suburb, but my parents separated, my father passed away, and my mother found herself a working single mom just trying to make it, right? And we did. We were able to make it. I never experienced homelessness as a child, certainly. But we were part of what these statistics would count as the working poor, right? My mother worked multiple jobs. She worked home, she was taking children into her home to provide childcare at periods of time. She was doing housekeeping and cleaning in other folks' house. She was doing gardening. But none of that is full-time work that comes with health insurance. So we had a home, and paid rent each month, and we had food. But that component of healthcare, that just wasn't there because health insurance dynamics have changed significantly since I was a child. But health insurance was a missing piece. And I think I tell that story as well because I think when we think about poverty, when we think about dynamics that we're addressing, both an individual need and structurally, I think it's important that we certainly pay attention to the dramatic, terrible, and tragic, unusual stories, but that we also pay attention to the stories that are much more common, the stories that I hear when I sit down with folks at a kosher senior cafe, at a synagogue, not too far from here, just up in Cranston, and sit with a woman who's 87 years old, who worked as a professional much of her life, and has a small but regular Social Security payment that she's receiving, but had one particularly brutal month where her heat, because of how her building an apartment works, her rent was maybe $900 or so, but her heating bill for that month was $1,100, and it just wasn't there, right? How do you come up with an additional $1,100 for a particularly brutal winter month in Rhode Island, and the importance of not turning off the heat? So all of these stories, these sort of what I term the unsexy stories, I think are really important when we think about how we get to these numbers and how we build to these numbers, and how we might address these numbers moving and going forward.
In your community, in your context, what are the religious resources that you have when you think about these questions of poverty? What hymns, what scriptures, what bits of theology, what comes to mind for you as resources that you have as a community talking about poverty? I also work as a spiritual director, so I'm really able to wait out silence quite well. Yeah,
I'm unclear on what you're asking. Are you asking
sure.
what tools do we have to deal with poverty spiritually and
So,
through
yeah,
our
so I'm
belief?
asking what resources are there in our tradition to help us understand poverty and our response to poverty as a faith community, right? What scriptures, what hymns, what resources do we have to think about these issues of poverty from within our faith context, right? Because it's different, right? It's different if I'm speaking to a Muslim group or a Jewish group or a Catholic group, it's different. But what are the resources that you have and turn to here?
Pantry. The food pantry.
Yeah, but I think she's looking for more
Like
spiritual.
I think of Matthew 25,
Right.
You think of Matthew 25.
whatsoever you do to one of the least of these, you do
Yeah.
unto me.
Yes, yeah, our starting scripture, yeah.
And then also just, the biblical narrative of Christ really helping the poor, serving the poor, befriending the poor,
Uh-huh.
in general.
Yeah, life of Jesus, that ongoing, there are so many stories that we could pick, but sort of Jesus with folks who are living at the margins and in poverty.
Right, and I think that that's also a metaphor where, sometimes we experience poverty, physical, monetary poverty, but also like we're all spiritually impoverished sometimes, so.
Yeah. Yeah. Other folks? Yeah?
It's almost to me like it's a story. I mean, if you go to Matthew, and you can find instances and places in the Bible that tell us what we should be doing, taking care of our fellow man. But for us, it's almost like if it's not good enough to make the upper half of the front page, it's just one of those things that we run along.
Yeah,
And that's the way most of it gets treated.
yeah. That's wonderful. So in case anybody couldn't hear, talking about the story and the story that we have in Matthew, and how that stands in contrast to our culture's tendency, if it's not the first half of the front page, it doesn't get recognized. So the story that we have as a community of faith versus the stories that might make that main media focus. Yeah. Anyone else? So I think a commonality in what I'm hearing folks say, and I'd point, there's just an amazingly rich biblical resource. There's also a really rich tradition if we look at where our ancestors have gone and where they have led. But what this all cycles back to for me is we have another story, right? We have a values-based story, right? We have a story that talks about people's worth as of incalculable importance, right? Whoever they are, right? We have a story that says all of us are of infinite worth before God, right? And that is a different kind of story, and I really appreciate what you said about, the front page of the newspaper. That is a different kind of story than the story that we so often hear, right? Which is a story about, to be crass about it, whose life is worth saving, right? A story about who merits housing, who merits enough to eat, who merits a job that can support their family, right? We live in a culture that I think often has those messages, and yet we have within our tradition this rich alternative story that says something different about who we are because of who God is, about who we are in relation to one another, and thus about what we are called to do moving forward. I think that since the Interfaith Coalition are so invested in making sure that faith communities are part of the public dialogue,
that faith communities' voices are present in this work of advocacy, because we think that there is a story that we can tell that is not only the story of Sunday morning or Friday night or Friday afternoon, depending on your tradition, but that is the story of value, the story of worth, the story of human dignity, and that is a story that has a place in our state house, in our legislation, in our budgeting priorities, right? So continuing to, it was what Pastor Jonathan talked about in his third level of the food pyramid, right? What is that gift that we can bring? And so I want to talk briefly about some action steps, and then have maybe a little space for Q&A. So needs it, just so folks know. So the Interfaith Food Pantry here in East Greenwich is open Monday, Wednesday, and Friday, 10:30 to 12, and that's a good emergency aid resource. SNAP benefits are really.
Excuse me one second. And your food donations that we collect on Communion Sundays go to the Interfaith Food Pantry.
Which is located where?
St. Louis.
It's 99 Pierce, yes,
Yeah,
it's
St. Louis.
99 Pierce, so not very far from you here. In addition to that resource, also SNAP benefits can be very important. Many families qualify, but actually also many elder folks qualify as well, and are under-enrolled in SNAP, so that can be a great and important resource in terms of supplemental food assistance. There's also assistance available through Live Heat, in terms of heat and energy assisting, as I was telling you about the experience of the woman at the kosher food pantry. Many folks here in Rhode Island really struggle with heating assistance. They can afford their other bills, but heat, especially in the winter months, can be challenging. So there are some resources available to help with that. And then it just passed, so it's probably too late to say it now, but keep in mind for next year, there's also resources available through many VITA sites for people who make under about $50,000. It's a fairly generous allowance to assist with tax preparation and to make sure particularly folks who qualify for things like the Earned Income Tax Credit are getting that resource and that help back. And that is a service available for free through the CAP agencies as well as others. I'd be happy to talk to folks individually if folks have any more detailed questions about that, but I just wanted to put those on the table. The second way to help is much of what you're already doing, like the collections that you're doing here for the Interfaith Food Pantry, the feeding programs that you are dedicated and committed to. Continuing to be a resource for one another in times of need is really important in this moment when our public social service and social safety net is not everything that it can or should be. So that's a really important way to get engaged. I would encourage you to continue to support those programs, but from everything I've heard from Pastor Ebony and Pastor Jonathan, you are already on that train, and I don't need to cheerlead for that anymore. The third piece then that I would mention that I think is so important as we think about action steps and ways to help is what we are most invested in as the Interfaith Coalition, which is to say, we are thinking so much about how do we provide this direct aid, which is very important, and we also need to ask the structural question of what is happening above us, above as folks are going down the stream to get to this place of need where we're then serving them a sandwich at Crossroads, where then they're meeting with Pastor Jonathan to get that emergency aid when they need it and can't make bills, whatever is going on. What's happening ahead of that? Because I will be really blunt with folks, 14.3% of us are living in poverty. We can be the most faithful collectors of food basket on Sunday morning, and that is not going to get us out of the 14.3% living in poverty. We really need to have some structural issues as well. So a few things I'd invite you to pay attention to as we think about that. Some issues that are going to be coming up at a policy level. One, the Earned Income Tax Credit. I had mentioned that earlier. Are folks familiar with the EITC?
Yes.
A little bit.
Yes, some people yes, some people no. Okay, so the Earned Income Tax Credit, folks receive at a federal level, but there's also a state equivalent, and it's for people who are working and struggling, right? So it's a benefit that is available to a pretty wide range of folks, but especially families with children. The income levels, if you're a single adult, are about $12,000, so fewer folks qualify for it. But families with children, it's up, way starting in the 20s, but up to like 45, 50, depending on how many children you have. And it goes like a bell curve, so that folks who make less are qualify for more earned income tax credit, and then it fades out based on how much you make and how much you earn. And what that does is it serves to supplement for so many of the families that we're talking about here who are working and just don't make enough to support their children. And so it's a particularly important program for addressing childhood poverty, which is what you have seen here, because it disproportionately targets and impacts families with children in making sure that they have those basics. That is money that helps to pay for diapers, for food, for housing, for car repairs. It's a really important component. It exists federally. It's had really strong bipartisan support for a long period of time. Reagan loved it. Clinton also loved it, right? So that doesn't happen that much. So we're thankful when we come across one of those issues. It still has bipartisan support at a federal level. It also exists as a parallel state program. So I'm going to get a little wonky, but try to roll with me if you can. So Connecticut and Massachusetts both also have state-level EITCs. It's a percentage of the federal earned income tax credit that you get back at the state level. It is 27.5% and 23%, respectively, in our neighboring states of Connecticut and Massachusetts. Here in Rhode Island, it's only 12.5%, right? So we're not even halfway to where our neighboring states are. So there is a strong push to try and increase the earned income tax credit to at least 20%. And we would still be a little bit behind Connecticut and Massachusetts, but we would be moving in the right direction. And that has a really direct impact. So for every percent in the law that we can move up the earned income tax credit, low-income families with children are getting back about an additional $55. So we move it up 1%, about $55. If we move it up as much as we want to, it'll be about an additional $400 or $500 of tax assistance that those folks are getting back to help them make it through. So that's a really important priority. The other thing that I would flag for you as a strong legislative issue to pay attention to is affordable housing. As you know, here in this community, housing costs in Rhode Island are really high, and that means a lot of folks are what we would call housing cost burdened. So they are paying more of their income as a percentage of their income than they should. So we're told we should be paying about 30% of our incomes in our rent or mortgage, and that is not what it is looking like for many folks in Rhode Island. Many of us are paying 50% and up, which then has these trickle-down effects because folks are struggling with food, struggling with utilities because so much is getting consumed in housing costs. So folks are working on an affordable housing bond. They're working on trying to see what we can do to shift the housing market and make housing more affordable for folks across the spectrum, and particularly to ease that burden on low-income families, low-income seniors, and folks who are transitioning out of homelessness as well. So I flag those as a couple issues for you to be thinking about and for you to be raising your voice on. We also have a conference on May 11th, which Pastor Jonathan mentioned, and I do have some handouts for anyone who is interested. If you do want to go, I'd encourage you to take one. I don't have one for everyone because I know many folks are working and won't be able to make it, but it's Wednesday, May 11th, and we'll be diving deeper into some of these issues, particularly talking about things like senior supports, that's a workshop, legislative priorities, also a workshop, the race gap, which someone mentioned as well, and then working locally with mayors, so that we can dive into this in a little bit more depth, because I do think it's an important issue as we continue to think about what poverty looks like in our community, and we realize that it is a issue on which I think we have profound resources to offer. I would say we have a unique voice as a faith community, number one. And number two, I would say we have a unique voice, and we are called to be effective, even when being effective is looking at the unsexy stories and the unsexy solutions, right? So looking at things like housing, EITC, and looking at the experience of so many folks who are living and struggling with poverty in ordinary day-to-day ways. I have a closing thought, but before I do that, I know we're at about time. So I just want to ask if anyone has any quick question before we close.
Jonathan, do we have a representative from our church that's part of this group? Or part of our?
Ebony's been working with.
So Pastor, I know she's at Warwick this morning, but Pastor Ebony Grissom has been active, and so she's been part of the team planning this conference, for example. But we would love and always welcome additional participation, engagement, support in an ongoing way.
One of the things that bothers me is the fact that the people who are coming into, people who are coming into a situation that they never thought they were going to, and that is health insurance, and the fact that they worked all their lives and they were totally insured, and they were healthy so far, and now all of a sudden it's falling to pieces.
Yeah, so that's a great, so the question was about health insurance, issues of the elderly and seniors. So I would commend that. I think that's a huge issue in a variety of different ways, including isolation. The Senior Agenda Coalition of Rhode Island, if folks don't know it, I encourage you to do it. We work closely with them. They are a leading senior advocate. They will be one of the voices that is there and present, along with Marie Carpenter and some others, on our senior supports panel. And they are the strongest and most tireless advocates around senior issues. They are looking at some of the health insurance issues that you are talking about. Unfortunately, some of those are at a federal level, so it also needs to be in combination with ARP and other folks as well. But they've been also strong champions of programs here at the state level, so things like Meals on Wheels, which was at risk of a very serious funding cut and then was able to get its funding restored. But their Senior Agenda Coalition of Rhode Island and Bill Flynn, I think, are the strongest advocates around that issue. We have an advocacy platform this year, I mentioned earlier, with 4 big categories in it, and one particularly support for seniors and people with disabilities. And what we are focusing on at the state level for that is thinking about the RIPTA Senior Disabled Bus Pass program and making sure we protect that in terms of seniors living in poverty not facing isolation and continuing to have access to food programs, recovery programs, all of the different pieces. And then also thinking about adequate funding for senior community centers. However, senior health insurance remains an issue that we care deeply about, that the Senior Agenda cares deeply about, and that we're continuing to want to think about not only at a state level but also at a national level, because I think a lot of the issues and challenges really with that are going to require national solutions as well as some Rhode Island level interventions. But thank you for that. Yeah.
I would just like to make one comment.
Sure.
I don't think people understand children of poverty and how you are treated and the attitude that they have towards you.
Yes.
Unfortunately, even in church.
Yeah.
There's a stigma.
Yeah. Yeah. I think that I thank you for saying that. Just talking about the stigma associated with poverty, what we still don't understand in church, and I always, maybe it's my background. One of my favorite scriptural texts is the Epistle of James, and James talks very expressly about what it means when we welcome those who seem to have power and privilege and prestige, and yet cast aside those who might be considered less than. And often that's people in poverty are considered less than, and children are considered less than, and children in poverty are particularly sort of scorned and forgotten. And I think we have a strong exhortation to be attentive and be mindful to that, right? The kingdom of heaven, right? If we do not welcome these, we're in big trouble in a lot of different ways. So thank you for saying that. Yeah. history, I would say, and history in our country, I would say two things. One, I would say we have so much to be proud of and so much to celebrate, right? I have a deep love for education. I have some background in that, and we're the first nation to have that the breadth of access to elementary and secondary education, right? That is such a gift and a legacy, and you think we take it for granted now. Everybody thinks, oh, of course we have public education. That was not an obvious thing, right? It was not an obvious thing that we should create these institutions, that we should be supporting and funding them, that we believe that all children, that was an idea that we had to persuade people of, that all children have this right to an education. And now we take it for granted, right? And as we think about the history of our country and that yearning towards, kings, the arc of the moral universe is long, but bends towards justice. As we think about reaching towards that, we have come a long way, and we do need to celebrate that. And we also need to think about the fact that is not always a continuous forward movement. So at the end of the 1970s, we were actually fairly far along the way of ending hunger in the country. We saw that we had done a lot of positive movement there. The number of private food pantries was around 200 in 1980. And now, as we know, it has ballooned enormously because the need has ballooned enormously. We have 60,000 people a month here in Rhode Island. Rhode Island doesn't have that many people, so 60,000 a month is a lot, right? So we make progress sometimes, and we make the progress so well that we just take things for granted. And then other things we take, 2 steps forward, 1 step back, 2 steps forward, 3 steps back, right? And so I long for the day where the way we think, of course every child deserves public education, we think also, of course, every family, every child, every individual should have a home and should have food. And that is no longer a thing for which we advocate at the State House. We don't go in January and pray in the State House believing that what we are doing is arguing for these things, because these things are so taken for granted that we can't imagine. We can't imagine. We say like, oh, remember way back when in great-grandpa's time, they had a lot of poverty, right? And we say it then in the way that we say now, and can you imagine? Can you imagine how there was slavery? Do you know that there was slavery in Rhode Island? And we all say it with a kind of shared horror. And I long for the day that we can, in a similar way, think about poverty as this kind of endemic poverty as a kind of terrible thing that happened once and have moved beyond it. And I think, I know we're a little bit late on time, so I'd be happy to take individual questions afterwards, but I'm going to use this as a way to end, and I want to close us with this, because I think as we were talking about resources we had earlier in our faith tradition, we were talking a lot about sort of moral instruction resources, direction resources that we have available to us. And I think we have those, but I also think we have something else, which gestures to the new heaven and new earth revelation text that was our reflection this morning. I think it's a similar kind of thing. It is a promise. And this is taken from Luke, but other good versions too. Then he looked up at his disciples and said, "Blessed are you who are poor, for yours is the kingdom of God. Blessed are you who are hungry now, for you will be filled." And note that this is all, this isn't blessed are you who are poor for someday maybe you might happen to get the kingdom of God. No. Blessed are you who are poor, for yours is the kingdom of God. Blessed are you who are hungry now, for you will be filled. Blessed are you who weep now, for you will laugh. Blessed are you when people hate you and when they exclude you, revile you, and defame you on account of the Son of Man. Rejoice in that day and leap for joy, for surely your reward is great in heaven, for that is what their ancestors did to the prophets. Blessed are we. Blessed are those that struggle. There is a promise. It is not a question of if, it is a question of when. But our invitation here, I believe, as faith communities, is to be a part of that process. Right? I want to be a part of that journey towards the when. I want to be a part of changing this story. 14.3% of us in Rhode Island are living in poverty. That is how it is now. It does not need to be that way. We have in our faith tradition a different story, a moral story, a value story. Let us tell that story. Let us tell that story in public in a way that creates change, so that I can meet with you in 5 years and we can say, oh, remember when the poverty rate was 14.3%. And you can tell your children, oh, remember when poverty was a plague in America. And it will be a story of long ago. So we pray and hope and work for that day.
Emily, thank you very much for sharing all that information, that presentation. And you didn't even say that if anyone wants to make a donation to the coalition, or the Interfaith Coalition, I know that you'd be happy to, on behalf of the coalition, accept that donation. They do excellent work, and the idea of having different faiths come together, that's a big thing right there. And then if you're interested in that May 11th conference, I know there's some flyers around, check that out. Thank you all for, yes, Janet.